Hi, Claudia. Yes, I can hear you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I apologize. In my I glanced at my phone this morning and read it as 10:30 instead of 10:15, so I was running late. I apologize.
Oh, okay. That's understandable. Okay. Claudia Center is a leading disability rights attorney dedicated to advancing civil rights through litigation, policy, and advocacy. She previously served as a senior staff attorney at the ACLU and directed the disability rights program at Legal Aid at Work. She played a key role in expanding protection under the Fair Employment and Housing Act and argued US Airways Inc. versus Barnett before the US Supreme Court. She's a recipient of the Paul G. Hearne Award. She has also taught disability law at Berkeley and Hastings. A Berkeley Law graduate, she also worked with NARAL and held a women's law fellowship. Is that right? That abbreviation is in NARAL?
Yeah, that's all good.
Okay, great. Was there anything you want to add to that bio or correct,
Oh
Claudia?
no, no, that's great. Thanks.
Okay, so for our first question, we're going to keep to the legal and continue with that theme, which is, in your view, what are the most pressing legal challenges you believe that are currently facing the disability community?
Well, I think a lot of communities right now are facing a lot of challenges with some of the policies and announcements from the incoming administration. And there are people with disabilities in every community, including, trans youth and immigrant communities and unhoused people um, and so on. Any legal challenge that is faced by any community right now is going to include people with disabilities. So I want to start with that. Some of the issues that we're facing right now um, are challenges to our strong legal protections for disability rights. For example, challenges to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Um, Challenges to uh, uh, disability inclusive policies and procedures by federal employers and contractors and grantees, and whether those will continue under Trump's executive orders. I mean, I think they can and should. Um, Challenges to the ability of trans youth to access services. Um, Many trans youth have other disabilities and are part of our community, so that's very concerning. Um, and then just generally, putting aside this particular set of challenges from this administration, we continue to face the problem that um, many disability rights principles are strong on paper, but are not enforced in practice.
Yeah, it sounds like you got your work cut out for you. That was a lot
Yes,
of challenges there.
yes,
A
there are
lot of
many. Yes.
uh and so what let's go back to the beginning and rewind a little bit. What led you to this path initially?
So when I went to law school, it was during the time that the ADA was signed into law, and I took a class in disability rights taught by Arlene Mayerson, who's one of the um, authors of the ADA and leading creators of disability rights, and worked at where I am now, Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. And th through that class, I met people with significant disabilities. I heard Ed Roberts speak. I learned about the principles of disability rights, and I found it really um, impressive and sort of changed my entire worldview about how our systems should be created. And it gave me a more inclusive view of how our systems and how our material world should work for everybody. And then I did become a public interest lawyer. I thought I was going to be a women's rights lawyer or workers' rights lawyer, and I did do those things. But when I started working on cases about workers with psychiatric disabilities, I came back to disability rights. I realized that I myself have a disability, a very common one, which is lifelong depression, clinical depression, and very common disability. But I hadn't even realized that that could be a disability until later, after I'd been a lawyer for a while. And since then, I've just really been passionate and engaged in enforcing disability rights, expanding disability rights, um, serving and supporting the disability community, trying to support disabled lawyers and law students, and all the steps we need to take to advance disability civil rights.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I think that uh, gets paints a picture of who you are and the work that we're about to discuss in a little bit more detail here that you've done. So, in terms of advocating for people with disabilities from a legal standpoint, what strategies do you find most effective when representing the disability community in the legislative and policy arena?
Well, I think one of the strengths of the disability community and of where I work, DREDF, um, is to be really inclusive about the strategies that we use. So, for example, it's very important to be closely connected to people with disabilities in the real world and to hear about the barriers that people are facing in the real world so that we know what's actually happening. And so I think the disability community has many networks that are that hear from uh, disabled people, families with children with disabilities, every day. And so that includes our legal services network, our centers for independent living, our parent training and information centers, and on and on. And so these networks really are a way that we can hear what people are facing in the real world. And I'm missing a lot of networks. Those are just some examples. And then we also, try to advocate with institutions to remove barriers. If there are systemic barriers, we think about bringing litigation. We think about trying to amend or change or strengthen a regulation or a law. If there's a case that raises an important issue in the courts, and it's in the appellate courts, we often will file an amicus brief that is representing a number of disability groups. We also develop public policy and data so that lawmakers and stakeholders can be advised by what's really happening for people with disabilities. And that does not happen unless we intentionally push for it to happen, because a lot of research and data collection do not include disabled people. So we have to really push to collect that data, to pull out that data, and to create reports that really shine a light on what's happening for disabled people. In fact, we're doing that right now with Medicaid and disabled people, and publishing data about why Medicaid is so critical to people with disabilities.
Thank you for sharing that. So we're gonna take a deeper dive in terms of focusing now on policy, but also technology and intersectionality. So, as a wheelchair user myself, I'm a manual wheelchair user due to contracting polio as a toddler, and then uh, I have severe scoliosis as well. And so, I've always been excited about technology, and for the longest time, even AI. And I'm sure you've heard of the the doom and gloom of of AI and the potential negative effects that it could bring as well. So the question is, what role do you believe technology plays in both advancing and potentially hindering disability rights?
So that's a big question. I think that technology can do both and can both advance and hinder the lives of disabled people. And I think our job as disability advocates is to push to make sure that we're included in whatever technology is being rolled out, whatever technology decisions are being made. We need to push to be at the table, and to fight whatever negative effects can happen from technology. So, for example, with self-driving cars. I mean, I live in San Francisco. We have Waymos everywhere. It's very common here that we have self-driving cars. So what does that look like for the disability community? In some ways, obviously, self-driving cars are a huge boon for certain disability groups, including blind, low vision people, people who can't drive for whatever reason, for whatever reason can't drive themselves. But what about wheelchair users? Why aren't self-driving cars wheelchair accessible? So those are the kinds of things that we're pushing. Why, how accessible are the apps for driverless cars? What about the seat belts? And, so we're really getting into yes, this is can be of use to disabled people, but is it all disabled people? And, is there an impact on public transit which disabled people need? So we're really trying to be holistic about technology.
Yeah, those are great points about, the access of it and who it'll be, and once it is available, how accessible is it? Because right now a lot of it is in development,
Yes.
and there's
Yeah, we get a
still,
lot of promises, but not so much reality so far on that.
yeah. Um, so another question on tech, how do you see artificial intelligence and emerging technologies shaping the future of accessibility and disability rights? So I guess expanding and maybe even repeating, it's a little repetitive, I realize, either positively or negatively.
So, one of the challenges about artificial intelligence in terms of decision making, like if um, a healthcare system or an employer or a government benefit program is making decisions in whole or in part based on automated decision making or artificial intelligence, that raises a lot of red flags for us because we don't know what is the underlying data that is going into the tools. And what we do know about that data is that it's infused with, ableism, anti-disability bias, and other kinds of bias. And so we don't have confidence that the decisions being made by artificial intelligence are fair to people with disabilities. And so we want to have more transparency about what data is being used. We want to have checks and balances in terms of the decision making, what kinds of um, reviews can be made about decision making to see how they affect disabled people. We maybe want to prohibit the use of this technology in certain sectors where the implications for disabled people are so grave. Um, we know, for example, in employment that if there's like a video interview that is reviewed by artificial intelligence, those AI tools um, can discriminate on the basis of if someone has a different kind of voice because of a disability or an impaired speech, or if they have certain body movements because of a disability. Maybe a difference in the face or the eyes or so on. And so we know that that's already happening based on the studies out there. And so these are really concerning for us that these tools are being rolled out without consideration of the impact.
Yeah. And in a lot of ways, you mentioned, they have these biases in them. And I was watching the Netflix special with Bill Gates on, the development of OpenAI, AI in general. And one of the things they said is it's in a in some ways a mirror of our own
Yeah.
biases and
Yes,
stereotypes. And so
absolutely.
we have to be careful in the development in that it's to mirror the best in us rather than, the worst or the current status.
I mean, there are ways that it can benefit people with disabilities. There are, for example, legal services organizations that use AI to do first drafts of letters that low income people need, like legal letters. And then the lawyers will go through and this is the important part is having the human go through and, update it and correct it. But it can save time, which can give more legal services to low income people. And, a lot of disability rights, as you know, um, don't happen by themselves. I mean, people should be following the law, but a lot of times the disabled person or their advocate actually has to speak up in order to access the right. And so legal services is really critical for disabled people. And if AI can make legal services more efficient and we can serve more people, that's a positive. AI can help us get complex language down to, fourth or fifth grade English. Again, the human has to go through and make sure it's correct, but it can, help us with that. So there are some examples where AI can help. I don't want to overlook those. I do have a lot of anxiety about the harms, though.
Yeah, yeah. So building on this topic, how do you see the evolution of bioethics impacting disability rights, particularly with the rise of genetic engineering and debates on curing, quote unquote, curing disabilities?
Um, yeah, I think that the disability community has, along with some other communities, have tried to elevate the issue of um, our history of eugenics and that we must be mindful of that history in our bioethics today. And so we see this happening, for example, during the pandemic, when at the beginning, including in Europe and here in the United States, um, different healthcare institutions and states put out crisis standards of care that set out how scarce medical resources would be allocated. And uh, disabled people were at the bottom of the list in some of these policies. And so we had to fight to have a different approach in those policies from a bioethics perspective of including disabled people and eliminating disability discrimination. And so we did have some success in modifying some of those policies to be inclusive of disabled people. But it showed that we have a lot of work to do. Um, the same thing happens around end of life. Are we going to have physician assisted suicide or, there's different terms for this depending on one's perspective. But how is the disability community reflected in those kinds of policies? And how, depending on how, the devil's really in the details. And so if there are not safeguards or, there probably can't be enough safeguards for, from our perspective, but um, such policies can tip over into euthanasia and, things that we find, um, that are horrifying.
Yeah. Thank you. You mentioned we talked about, I mean, this whole thing in a direct or indirect way talks about disability rights, right? I want to, for just very briefly, talk about rhetoric and how we word things. What are your thoughts on the use of disability rights versus disability justice? What other types of language in in this field that you think would is worthy of having a conversation about?
Well, that's a great question. And, I came up in the disability rights era, and disability justice is, the ADA generation, the people younger than me have come up with the ADA and all the laws in place, and a lot of advocates have embraced disability justice, which I do as well. Um, I think that disability right, everyone may have their own definitions, but from my perspective, disability rights is about equality and equity. It's about strong disability rights laws and regulations and principles. It's about enforcing them vigorously, zealously across all of our systems. They're very, very important rights, many of which have yet to be realized. I think disability justice includes all of that, but also includes an intersectional frame looking at how people with disabilities are, what the material reality is for people with disabilities in different situations, such as incarcerated disabled people or disabled people in the dependency court system or the family regulation system, people who are unhoused, undocumented, impoverished, hungry. And so I think disability justice calls on our communities and our organizations to be responsive to people with disabilities in all kinds of situations, to support the rights and needs of these communities. I think disability justice includes a commitment to basic human needs, housing, clothing, food, healthcare, transportation for everyone, regardless of status. We're very far away um, from that reality. And so for that reason, a lot of disability justice networks build mutual aid mechanisms to try to provide that for one another in the short term now on the ground. So I think disability justice is a really important vision and commitment. I think it can be hard for those of us who are lawyers with a lot of lawyering experience because there's no way to bring a case that gets people their basic human needs in our current legal system, which is why non-lawyers and organizers are so important.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you grew up uh, with the disability rights phrase. What, how has the change in language um, affected your work? What has, yeah, impacted your work?
Well, I think that disability justice has pushed all of the disability organizations and advocates, including me and DREDF, into a more intersectional frame of disability rights, which was, much needed. So I think that we're engaged in issues that way back when maybe weren't initially recognized as disability rights issues, or they were recognized, but just they're elevated now. And I'm kind of repeating myself, but just um, that we should be um, supporting justice in the area of unhoused people or incarcerated people or people interacting with police or people who are don't have their needs met. Um, and
Yeah.
so, that means more coalitions, that means more connecting with community-based organizations. So it does change what the work looks like.
Hmm. Yeah. What personal experiences have most profoundly influenced your commitment to disability rights advocacy? I know earlier you shared that your disability of depression, mental in the mental health space.
Yeah, I think my personal experiences as having severe depression and mood swings, particularly at certain points in my life, have influenced me. Working and living with people with disabilities has affected my commitment to disability rights, being in community. I think peer support and disability community are incredibly important, both for supporting us in the long run to doing this work and for keeping each of us, including myself, in touch with um, what's important to people, what's needed. So I think a lot of disabilities have peer support. I myself joined a digital community probably 25 years ago of women with psychiatric disabilities that I'm still part of. And uh, those networks continue. Like nowadays, for example, there are networks of law students with disabilities that are really important for peer support and resources, sharing resources. Um, so I think all to see the power of those networks and the how helpful they can be, that has shaped my commitment to disability rights and also just finding personal satisfaction. Well, that sounds too definite, but finding that the work is important to me and that matters. I'm lucky that I am able to work in a job that is, consistent with my values.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, you you pointed out something awesome, which is like these days, uh, even especially after the pandemic, a lot of resources, support groups or whatnot, can be accessed online, and there are so many different types of groups. Um, so whatever uh, kinds of disabilities people have or support, there's likely some sort of support group either in person or online, and that people can find.
Yeah, and I think that is another positive of technology, as we talked about before, that people can get information, they can find other people with the same experience much more quickly and with more, easier than before the internet was available to everybody.
Mhm. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the future with our last 10 minutes here. So how can the disability rights movement evolve to be more transformative, intersectional, and progressive in the next 50 years?
That is such a good question because my mind is really on the emergency of the moment. So I'm thinking about how we can work together to defend Medicaid and to defend our civil rights and civil liberties in this moment. And that is really important. We have to do that. But at the same time, we have to be planning for what comes after that. We have to assume that we're going to successfully defend Medicaid, defend our civil rights and civil liberties, or if we fail, that we'll fight to regain them and to expand them. But can you say your question again so I can
Yeah, of
formulate?
course.
Yeah.
Of course. So the question was, how can the disability rights movement evolve to be more progressive? Um, intersectional, and transformative in the next 50 years?
So I think there are a lot of small steps that add up to transformation over time. So it is transforming our organizations and networks to be radically inclusive. That's going to take time. It is strengthening our connections with other communities, for example, fostering and strengthening our relationships with LGBTQ organizations, transgender leaders, transgender organizations, immigrant organizations, unhoused people, organizations and networks that fight for food and clothing and shelter, strengthening our connections with climate justice advocates, people fighting for a safe environment for everyone. And really developing leaders to take those next steps, because typically, each generation of leaders can bring a movement to the next level. And then it's, from my point of view, typical that then to get to the next level, that leader has to pass the baton. So we need to do that for several cycles as well. So those are some of the steps. I'm sure there are many more that I've missed.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So, next question is, what does true liberation for people with disabilities look like beyond legal protections and policy changes?
Well, I think true liberation is part of what disability justice is trying to envision and to share that vision with everyone. And so I think it is true liberation includes having what one needs. So having a place to live, a community, food to eat that is that meets the person's needs, clothing, freedom from fear of persecution or violence, justice, that people's concerns about injustice are responded to with justice. Communication, transparency, access to durable medical equipment, and all the different healthcare and medications and services and supports that people need, living wage for everyone, universal basic income. So, there are many elements to create that would go into creating true liberation.
Yeah, there are many, many components. So, the last question is, in your most optimistic vision, what does a world without ableism look like? What will it take for us to get there?
Well, I do think that one of the things that will help reduce ableism is to bring people with disabilities into every sector of society, whether it's, medical school, doctors, lawyers, every profession, the Senate, the House of Representatives, the presidency, and to bring a disability rights and disability justice perspective into all of the important institutions that exist. I think those institutions, for better or worse, contribute greatly to the messages that people receive. So, journalism is another example. Um, I think reducing ableism includes education. So, there's a lot of obvious uh, backlash to education right now. There's a lot of the announcements from the new administration is about dismantling education about our history of, for example, slavery or eugenics or um, racism and uh, homophobia, transphobia. And so I think education is part of reducing ableism, and we have to push back against the backlash in order to make sure education gets out. Um, I think a world without ableism is where people get to make choices. They get to live up to their potential. They get to be who they want to be. They get to have jobs if they want a job. Um, Inclusion, they get to be included. People get to be included. Those are some examples.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we still have a couple minutes left. Was there anything that I didn't ask you that you were, burning to talk about and think it's important to for our listeners to know?
Well, I think it's important for us to focus on what we can change and influence in the short term, since that's where my brain is today. And so I think that we can, that we should look at where we should consider what can we do now to defend ourselves and our siblings in our community.
We're about to get timed out, but
Okay.
before we do, I just want to thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of your wisdom and knowledge here in the legal arena. Yeah, have a wonderful day.